1. During my college years, around 2004 or 2005, I worked as a sales associate for a shoe store. I lived in a big enough city that there were 3 or so malls, each with one of these stores. My sister and I moved across town, and I put in a request to transfer to the store at the mall that my apartment would be closer to. The new location was a combination store. One side was the store in which I worked, shoes for ladies, and the other side was a store selling kids' shoes. It was confusing because the stores had the same name but were in fact owned by 2 different companies. But that's not pertinent to the story. Each store had its own set of employees, so there were that many more people to get to know, and personalities to try to figure out. I started working at this combo store right after the back-to-school rush, so there was an overstock of backpacks that were hung on the tall shoe shelves that were located right as you walk into the stockroom from the sales floor. One of my first days working there, I was helping a customer and headed into the stockroom for a size. I stopped once I got through the doorway as I had forgotten the size the customer had requested. I've heard that passing through doorways makes people forget things. I stood there looking at the hanging bags, trying to remember the size, couldn't remember, turned and went back through the door and then, of course, immediately remembered the size. So again, I went back into the stockroom only to find all of the backpacks laying all over the floor. I had been standing no more than 8 feet from them when they fell. I would have expected them to make a noise, but there had been no sound. So I grabbed the shoe for the customer and went back to the sales floor and told the assistant manager, from the kids' side, who we will call Ryan, what had just happened, hoping I wouldn't get in trouble for the mess. He said, "Oh, it was probably Jimmy." I hadn't been introduced to a Jimmy, and Ryan was the only guy working, so I asked, "Who is Jimmy?" With zero humor in his face or demeanor, Ryan replied, "Jimmy is a ghost in the stockroom." I was trying to figure out if he was pulling my leg when my manager, we'll call her Natalie, walks by and she asks, "What's up?" So I told her that Ryan was messing with me by telling me that there's a ghost in the stockroom. Without missing a beat, she says, "Jimmy, what do you do now?" Turns out they were dead serious. Apparently things would move in the stockroom and ladders would rattle when there was no one around to move or rattle them. They even had a backstory for me which sounds totally cliché, and I have no way of verifying it. I don't know if this story is true or not, but here is what they told me. Jimmy was a friend of some of the employees on the kids' side of the store. He didn't technically work there, but would get hired on for temporary or seasonal times for stocking the back room. And he generally spent a lot of time at the store just hanging out. Which, there were several of those types of people that would come in and just hang out during my employment at this location, so that wasn't a far-fetched concept for me. Anyway, one weekend, Jimmy planned on driving to the next big city to surprise a friend for her birthday or something. Which meant that his local friends and family expected him to be away for a while, and the people in the other city were not expecting him. You may see where this is going. Between the cities, Jimmy perhaps falls asleep at the wheel and drives off into a ditch, or something else along those lines. Anyway, he is killed in the wreck, which happens in the night, in a remote area when no one is around to see it, and the wreck catches fire, leaving Jimmy unidentifiable. So his body stays at a morgue as a John Doe for a while before his friends and family realize he's missing. If this is true, it's a tragic story, and my condolences go out to Jimmy and his friends and family. The backpacks were my first encounter, but I had many others before the store moved to a different location in the mall. One of the more minor incidents took place while I was walking between the tall shoe shelves in the stockroom, when I heard a sort of shuffling above me. It almost sounded like a critter was crawling around the boxes at the top. I looked up just in time to have a single box of shoes fall from the top of the shelf straight towards my face. I caught it in time and I said, Well, that wasn't very nice, Jimmy. I don't know if this was paranormal or just unbalanced boxes, but it was odd enough of an incident for me to take note of it. I think it was a sound before the falling box that marked it in my mind as not normal. This was the most aggressive incident that I experienced, if you can call it aggressive. Later on in my employment with this company, I was promoted to a position called shift leader, which meant that I wasn't a manager and still only had part-time hours, but I had keys and was allowed to perform opening and closing duties. They were phasing this position out at the time, but my manager Natalie was a manager trainer and was allowed more leeway in the way of running her store. In the mornings when I opened, I would sometimes be there by myself for a little while, until the kids side person would show up. It was usually at this time when I would hear the ladders in the stockroom on the kids side rattling, like someone was stepping on them. There were those rolling ladders that were attached to bars high on the shelf that would lock down when stepped on. The rattling sounded like the ladder was being rolled a short distance and stepped on, with enough pressure to rattle the springs, but not enough for it to lock into place. It creeped me out, but it never really scared me. However, I would spend as little time in the stockroom as I could when I was by myself. The next series of events started when I closed one night, and ended the next morning when I opened again. This experience sounds ridiculous, but I swear this is what happened to me. It was a slow night, and it was only myself working the ladies' side and the assistant manager Tiff on the kids' side. At closing time, Tiff still had a customer on her desk, but I was able to close my gates since I was a separate store. At this time, we had a rolling shoe rack containing clearance shoes on the sales floor. The rack sat perpendicular to the main path which went from the cash wrap to the front of the store. I walked by the shoe rack on my way to the front gate, closed the gate and turned around. When I looked back towards the cash wrap, I could see a shoe in the center of the path that I had just taken with its toe pointed toward me. I kind of chuckled to myself because of the way it was perfectly centered in the path, about 2 feet from the rack, as though it had been placed there, instead of falling off and randomly landing there. I picked it up and set it back on the rack, and then I ran a test. I knocked the shoe down off the rack to see how it would land. It landed only a few inches from the rack and bounced once and landed askew on its side. I did this a few more times with similar results until I heard Tiff ask me what I was doing. I put the shoe back on the rack and shrugged. "Nothing," I told her. I went to the register to close it down, and then went to the stockroom to get the paperwork from the printer. Tiff was finishing with her customer about this time, and came to the back to put extra shoes away before closing her register. When I came back to the sales floor, the same shoe was sitting in the same spot, in the very center of the path, again with its toe pointing toward me. This means that it was now pointing in the opposite direction than it had been the first time. I ignored it and smiled because it was just too silly to be scary. I finished closing and I put the shoe back on the rack, and then waited for Tiff so we could make the deposits together. Next morning I showed up to open the store, and you probably guessed it. The shoe was back in its perfect position, pointing its toe toward me yet again. I said, "All right, Jimmy, that's enough." I put the shoe back on the rack, and that was the end of it. The next time I experienced something was during the back-to-school rush. There were many employees present at the store, and even more customers. I ran back to get a shoe from the back shelf, and I noticed that I was the only one in the back, which struck me as odd, since there were so many of us in the store. Anyway, while looking for the shoe, I heard a voice say in a loud, harsh whisper, "Hey!" So I glanced over my shoulder, and down the aisle between two tall shelves, and saw someone kind of peek their upper body around the shelf, and then go back out of view. I looked down the next aisle where the person would have been, and no one was there. The stature of what I saw was very short and thin. The only person that looked remotely similar to what I saw was an employee on the kids' side named Mona. I got my customer's shoe and went to the front asking where Mona was, and the manager said she was up at the front folding t-shirts. I asked him if she had been in the back. He said he didn't think so. I went to ask her anyway. She said she had been at the front of the store all day folding shirts, and hadn't been to the back since she arrived at the store a few hours earlier. I'm not sure what I saw, and since I only saw it out of the corner of my eye, there is very little detail to remember, but it looked like a short, solid black shadow. Eventually, the kids' store was closed, and the ladies' store moved into a different part of the mall, and my manager, Natalie, transferred to a bigger store in a bigger city. I have often wondered if any of the other stores that used that space experienced anything after we left. I also eventually left the store to do some internships for college. After I graduated, I moved to be with my fiancée in the same big city that Natalie had transferred to. I needed a job, and she took me on until I could find a job in the same field as my degree. My first day there, she went to the back to eat her lunch, and came back to the front and asked me if I had taken a bite of her apple. I said, no. She looks at me and said, I swear Jimmy followed me. She proceeded to exclaim about the bite from her apple, and pointed to the other employees on the sales floor and said, tell them that I'm not making Jimmy up. They don't believe me. So I did. Anyway, whether or not Jimmy followed her, I don't know. I never had an experience at that location myself, but I do believe that there really was something to Jimmy at the original store. I know there is no way to prove or make anyone believe who doesn't want to, so I won't try. But the experiences that I came away with have stayed with me for 10 years, and make for a good story at any rate. 2. This is a paranormal story which is a bit hard for me to stomach, as I am an atheist and, generally speaking, do not believe in ghosts, demons, or monsters. That being said, I cannot easily explain away this or my other spooky stories with the ease that would make me confident enough to say, nope, definitely not ghosts. When I was little, I always heard and saw things that older people and most other kids didn't. Shadows, movement behind a slightly closed door, strange voices, and so on. I did not and do not have any psychological disorders, so I'll chalk this up to the whole kids and pets, see what we can't see theory. I've always been a restless sleeper, and on average, even back then as a child, it takes me 1 or 2 hours to fall asleep, which usually meant when my parents were ready to go to bed, my sleepy eyes were still refusing to close and sleep. Because of this, my mother often would walk past my door with the hallway light on, because I had a terrible fear of the dark. I would see her silhouette, and she would tell me, "Nighty-night, Milu," a combination of my first and middle name, and I, in return, would respond with, "Night-night, Mama." We'd exchange I love yous, and she'd walk back down the hall and to her bedroom. Usually after that, I could finally go to sleep. Well, this one night, we went through the normal routine. I was put to bed, I stayed up, Mom checked on me, and then we both went to bed. Only this time, Mom came back. The feminine silhouette walked down the hall, paused at my door, and leaned her head in just like Mom did. This was weird because it was not only the second time that night, but because she didn't initiate the nighty-nights. So after a few seconds of her silently staring at me, I decided to break the silence and I said, "Night-night, Mama." No response. "Mom?" I asked out. She leaned back out of my door, turned around, and walked back down the hall. I didn't really think much over it because all I ever saw of my mother when she came to say goodnight was her shadow against the bright light of the hallway, lit up from behind. But the next morning I asked Mom why she came to visit me a second time that night, and why she didn't respond to me. She looked at me weirdly and told me she hadn't come to check on me that second time at all, just like the first time she did every night. Nothing more came of this. It didn't happen again. And I wasn't really scared of the happening as a child because the woman, whoever she was, or whatever she was, didn't feel frightening. But when I spontaneously remembered this, even only a few years ago, it seriously creeped me out. And now, whenever I sleep at my parents', I have to keep that hallway door shut. 3. There was a time during college that I lived in a rental house my parents owned, with 3 other roommates, Mitch, Ann, Josh, and Elle. It was a beautiful little steal of a house, newly renovated, wood floors, big rooms, fenced-in yard. But because it was in a less than developed area, it was cheap to buy. We lived there very happily with one another for the first few years, until Mitch developed a drinking problem after the breakup with a long-term and beloved boyfriend. The story about his alcoholism isn't the scary part of this story, though it did greatly worry us. But as he sank into depression and alcohol abuse, weird things started happening around our house. It started with just weird noises, escalated to bad dreams. Eventually it became just downright strange. Anne, a very level-headed and rational woman, came downstairs moments after she had just gone up, looking rather worried. "There's a person in my room," she told us quietly. "I saw the big shadow of a man." And, of course, being unarmed idiots, we grabbed whatever weapons we could think of. I think mine was a desk lamp. And walked upstairs to confront whoever was in Anne's room. Of course, we get up there, flick on the light, and nothing is there. We decided not to think too much of it. The light was off. She was tired from a day of studies. We left it alone, but definitely became more aware of the feeling in the house. Mitch got worse. He had met yet another guy who broke his heart, and that plunged him way worse into his troubles and drinking. And so things in the house got weirder. He started seeing the shadow man, saw him once in the hallway, standing there like a disapproving, fear-provoking father-type figure. Mitch said he came back downstairs and went back up there a few minutes later, and it was gone. We, of course, took this with a grain of salt because the man was drunk more often than not, and we figured that he was just seeing things. But given Anne's experience before then, we didn't completely dismiss it. Just weren't 100% certain. Finally I saw it. Not a full figure, but a movement out of the corner of my eye. Like dark feet rushing up the stairs. I'm not going to lie, it scared the shit out of me. And I have a hard time believing in ghosts. I still loved the house, I still felt comfortable downstairs and in my room, but I would sprint up those stairs and down the hallway from that point on. I never saw it again after that, though. But we did have other incidences. A stand-up mirror that was in a closed room, Mitch's room actually, with no draft had been pushed over and smashed. Mitch was not home and no one had been in his room. A guest followed a shadow into the kitchen because she thought it was Josh, the less mentioned roomie, because he was a tool, only to find the kitchen completely empty and other stuff like that. Mitch eventually moved out when his alcoholism started affecting our friendship. He wouldn't get help, and we couldn't handle his party lifestyle anymore. He left, and whatever activity was going on left with him. Mitch did eventually get help. He went to rehab and has been sober for over 4 years now, I think. But he still remembers the time vividly, and remembers the feeling of obsession he felt every day while living with his addiction. None of us, all still friends, except Josh, dickbag, are really certain what happened in the house with all the activity. But if I had to stretch my neck out and accept the concept of the paranormal, I'd probably go with some sort of poltergeist activity. Something was fueled by Mitch's horrible state. I'm just happy that negative energy doesn't follow Mitch anymore. 4. Not exactly a typical scary story, but I nearly got killed by being run over by a pontoon boat as a kid. My family and the neighbor's family went out on our pontoon boat, and we were looking for the point, a term given a random area in the middle of the lake that was shallow and sandy rather than deep, weedy and murky. To search for the point, we'd stop the boat every 10 feet or so, and us kids would take turns jumping off of the boat to see if we could touch. Well, one time my neighbor's father didn't realize that both his daughter and myself jumped right in front of the pontoon boat. He started the boat and started driving forward. Luckily, we were wearing life vests, so we were able to bob up and grab onto the metal rafters holding the boat together. My mother was soon screaming at the man to stop, and we were pulled out of the water by our mothers and clung to them. We were no more than 8 at the time and pretty freaked out at the fact that we nearly got chewed up by a propeller. 5. I have had several paranormal encounters, but mostly they revolved around one house. When I was 12, we moved to the southern half of my state that I currently live in. This house was the first time I'd ever lived in an actual house. I was excited. But was I ever wrong? The first experience was on our first night in our own rooms. My little brother had come over to my room and opened my door because he was scared. And that was normal. You know, little brothers scared in a new house. Later that night, I heard the doorknob jiggling. I thought it was my little brother, so I got up and opened the door. There was nothing. Now, the way that the hallway was, my room was across from a little closet that was used for blankets and storage of certain knickknacks here and there. That doorknob started jiggling. I could feel my heart in my ears. But once again, when I opened up the door, there's nothing. I shut the door quickly and jumped back into bed, feeling scared and unsure what to do. This was one of many experiences I've had in that house. Another one that was very memorable took place in the living room. My sister and I sat down to watch our favorite show. It was one of the only things we could actually agree on. The whole entire house was completely dark, so it makes the situation even more creepy. The way that the house was set up, to give you a good idea. There was the living room, and then it was an entryway for the front door. And then there was the dining room. And then there was a kitchen. All of these were separated by 4 different walls. In the middle of the show, we heard heavy footsteps. Did not seem abnormal, as my mom's ex-boyfriend would wear his shoes in the house. Now, these footsteps sounded as if they belonged to a man, 6 foot, about 250 pounds. My mom's boyfriend was only about 5'6" and 130 pounds. The footsteps started from the kitchen and worked their way slowly to the dining room to the entryway. Then the footsteps stopped in the entryway. Somebody was there, but we couldn't see them. My little sister stood up and walked over to the entry, and she looked into the dining room. She jumped back, and I screamed. My mother and her boyfriend came rushing downstairs. When we told them what happened, of course, they didn't believe us. Well, my sister said she saw a man standing in the dining room. When she looked in, he lunged at her. She says the only thing that made him disappear was my scream. Now, people will say, but that's fake. But I know it's real. I have a lot of different experiences. These 2 are very memorable to me. I'll never forget that house. Never. Hey everyone, Hellfreezer here, and thank you very much for listening to 5 True Subscriber Stories, episode 24. Thank you very much to everyone who sent their stories in. Incidentally, stories 2, 3, and 4 were all written by the same person. They are discreetly credited below with the requested username. Well, into December now, I'll have to go and buy some fresh wrapping paper, I think. I've probably got some somewhere, but by the time I got some new stuff, I've been using the same roll for the past 4 or 5 years. Actually, no, you know what? When I think it's probably more like 8 years. It was a very long roll, so it's done for ages. Probably about time I got some new stuff. I will, of course, have to stock up on the usual essentials, and in my house, at least growing up as a kid, that always meant, you know, you'd have the mince pies, which I love. I love them even better after Christmas when they're like going for half prices, sometimes even cheaper. So that'll be the all-mince pies, and yes, Madeira cake was generally popular, and shortbread, which I tend to eat more at Christmas time than any other time of the year, even though you can get it year-round. Oh, incidentally, before I forget, if you do have a story you'd like to send in, then the link is in the description below. That's kingofthecities@gmail.com. And also, as you can see from my fancy new end card, if you're not looking at it, look at it, you'll see it's new and fancy, that all the contact information is there. So if you're sending a story, use the Gmail address, right? It's much more convenient for me if you use it that way. Please don't send it through YouTube right now, and the reason for that is because I'm only getting messages half the time through YouTube. It's just another one of those little problems YouTube's having lately. So what's happening is, if you send me a message, then I'll get a notification in my email inbox saying, hey, there's a message for you sent to on YouTube. Just go here to reply to it. And they're only there half the time. They're not been filtered out as spam or anything like that, and so they're just not showing up. So if you do have a message and it is important for me, just use the Gmail link, so for messages and stories. And if it's just a question or something you want to ask and you'd rather use Facebook, Facebook's totally fine for that. It's just that format's fine for questions, it's just not ideal for longer posts. Okay, and with that, I think I'm going to head off for now, because I had one of those days. You ever get those days where you just wake up with a headache? I went to bed feeling like one was coming on, then I woke up today and headache. It's probably because my sleep's so out of whack. It'll sort itself eventually. I was on my hands and knees earlier, looking for where I dropped my packet of ibuprofen so I could take something for the headache. But I found them. Saved me having to run out and buy more. Yeah, anyway, so with that, I'm going to head off. So until next time, thank you very much for listening, and take very good care of yourselves.